When it comes to which candidate Democratic primary voters think will fight for ordinary people like them, Senator Bernie Sanders is their man, with 57% of voters saying he would fight for them a great deal. Senator Elizabeth Warren is a close second at 53%, and then Joe Biden more than 20 points behind at 34%.
Author Matt Stoller has documented why Sanders is popular amongst the Democratic base, but not party elites. So Matt joins us now to expand more on this. He's a fellow at the Open Markets Institute and author of a terrific book called Goliath. And George, encourage everybody to go and check that out.
And great friend of the show.
Absolutely.
Obviously.
I have to get all those caveats in before we start talking about it. Matt, one of the things we originally had you on for was you had a great tweet thread about how the Democratic Party establishment itself can be thought of as a monopoly, that not is generally responsive to the interests of its consumers. In this case, it's the voters. Expand on that and how you see it in view of the Sanders phenomenon.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me on, first of all.
Always.
So I study monopolies. And one of the things you notice when you talk to anyone from doctors to booksellers to cheer coaches to just tech people who are under the influence of a coercive economic power, they're afraid. They're fear of retaliation. And when I started to notice after the Democratic debacle in Iowa with the shadow app and acronym and all that weird sort of stuff, it was a similar sense of fear. So after Acronym which was the company that made the app and basically screwed up the caucuses, it's by a woman who's she's a well-placed operative. She has basically a lot of billionaire donors, and people were afraid to go on the record against her after she screwed up the caucuses, right? After the Boeing 737 MAX of the Democratic Party, they were afraid to criticize her. And the criticism was like, oh, she's talented, but a little bit reckless. And it's like, so I was like, that's exactly what it feels like in all these other industries. And what you have in the Democratic Party elites is a set of networks of think tanks and law firms and kind of sinecures and consultants who all are effectively controlled by a very small group of people, which is exactly what you see in any cartel situation. And so you don't have, like, today they're kind of controlled by the tech bros, right? The tech bro billionaires.
Yeah.
And their attitude is disrupt. Let's have a software solution. So what does the Democratic Party do? They just go for a software solution for whatever. And that's what happened with the Acronym app. And that's what the problem with concentrations of power in every industry. People don't think about the Democratic Party as a business, but it is actually a business for a lot of people who work kind of in the establishment. And that's what we saw in Iowa. And we saw, just like Boeing is a domestic monopoly, when they had a 737 MAX because they don't actually do a particularly good job. That's what we saw in Iowa as well. It's just people were stealing, and the result was just incompetence.
Right.
And how much of that power is real and how much of it is imagined? Because if there's no power, then there's no fear and there's no threat, et cetera. But how much of that is just projection and how much of it is actual power?
I mean, I think so a lot of people kind of imagine that the establishment puts their thumb on the scale for different candidates, which they can do somewhat. I mean, MSNBC is kind of a faction, right, for certain candidates and not others.
Yeah.
But really, this is about self-dealing. So what I'm blanking on her name, but Acronym, what they were doing.
Tara.
Well, Tara. What was her last name?
It's all right. We don't need to call her out.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What they were doing is they were self-dealing. So they were just trying to get rich. They weren't trying to throw the caucuses for one candidate or another. They were trying to make money and from their donors, and then they were also then they tried to cover it up. Right. And that's the whole. So it was like a conspiracy. It just wasn't a conspiracy to steal it from Bernie Sanders, even though they didn't like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Well, that's one thing I've tried to focus on here, Matt, is that I'm not sure people understand the sheer amount of money that is involved with these party machines. As you talk about law firms, think tanks, consultants, it's like these populist movements on the left and the right are direct threats to millions of dollars in income for two established party machines like gig flow, right? That's what Crystal's always talking about, is the amount of money that flows in between up and down the donor chain is immense. And this really is a direct threat to that. Yeah,
no, that's exactly right. And it's a threat to a whole social hierarchy. And that's what you see. And in every one of these kind of like industries, like the cheer, I'm obsessed with the cheerleading monopoly because it's like hilarious, but also really interesting. But you see the same thing. You see like the monopolist, which is a company called Varsity Brands. Like their people tell cheer coaches and athletes, they're like, oh, that's not cool what you said about us. Like that very same like passive aggressive like obnoxious kind of culture which exists on the progressive left. I mean, talk to anybody who works in progressive politics. It's a nightmare culture. Like people are mean to each other. The management is awful, but it all comes from the fact that they're trying to fight for social justice, but the concentration of power is intense, and it's in the hands of a small group of operatives that kind of control access to the donor world. And that's not how it used to be. When you had more kind of distribution of power across the economy, more equalization of wealth prior to the 1980s. It didn't work this way. There were political machines. But they were much more like kind of egalitarian. They were dirty in a lot of ways, but they were egalitarian, and so the culture was a lot healthier.
It was also, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was also more distributed. Now you have basically national politics and nothing else. Then you had strong state parties, you had strong local parties, and so there was more distribution of power, I guess, even though a lot of it was corrupt and very dirty. But this is the thing that I do try to explain to people about why the Democratic establishment hates Bernie Sanders so much. It's really not ideological. It's not because they are so opposed to Medicare for all, although it does then tie directly into their financial interests, because many of them, they get donations from healthcare, the health insurance.
You're
like it's all right. But the real problem isn't ideological. It's about their own personal financial interests at the end of the day.
Well, so it depends how you define. I think there's a lot to that. It depends how you define ideology. So one of the things that you saw, and I think one of the things that Bernie advocates for, is at the same time you saw these distributed like local machines, you also saw a whole bunch of more local banks and local stores. You didn't have the Walmarts, you didn't have the roll-ups of power in every sector of the economy. So this actually goes along with a whole transformation of the American order. And if you look at what Bernie is saying, he's talking about the importance of credit unions, the importance of breaking up banks, the importance of antitrust, the importance of labor unions, which actually have the effect of moving capital from Bentonville and Seattle across the economy.
Right.
So there's a sort of vision and a shape of our society, and it actually goes along with moving capital outside of the centers where Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco, Chuck Schumer from New York City, both centers of capital, Rahm Emanuel, Chicago, center of capital, moving power outside of those areas, both in the economy writ large, but also out of our politics, which is controlled by those same centers of capital.
Yeah, and that's where the donors come from, and then that's what you see, right?
Well, that's where the monopolists live,
and that's what you see with Bloomberg. I mean, who could not be the more perfect foil to this moment? I think is that you see this hundreds of millions of dollars that he's willing to spend, and the fact that this establishment is just willing to take it. I mean, the most brazen attempt at buying an election in modern American history, and they'll take the cash, no problem, right? They'll cut ads, they'll do events, everything.
There's a split between the younger operatives. So the older operatives want a new boat, and the younger operatives want a new Tesla. Yeah. So that's the split of the Bloomberg in the Bloomberg campaign.
What it comes down to.
That's how you really explain it.
One last question for you, because you've been, at times you've been a real champion of Elizabeth Warren's ideas and parts of her campaign. She, obviously underperformed in the first two primaries, now in the Nevada caucus as well. She's really underperformed. What do you think happened there? Because there was a time when she was really the front runner. She seemed to have it all. She seemed to have walked this line between, the more revolutionary ideas, but being someone who was not scary to those like Democratic establishment monopolists. Where do you think that she went wrong? So I
don't know. Like when people are like, can so and so win? Can so and so do well in this state? I'm like, I don't know. Voters just chose Bernie Sanders over Warren. And what I think is important about both Bernie and Warren is they both come out of this. They come from different places. So Warren came from Harvard Law. Bernie came from kind of a more labor-oriented, community organizing bent. But they both have problems with concentrations of power. I mean, it would be self-serving for me to say this, but I'll say it because I'm self-serving. I think that she didn't focus enough on concentrations of power. I think she actually kind of had too much. I mean, I don't know what voters want, right? I'm completely mystified about Democratic voters these days. But I think like Bernie kind of emphasized more wages, right? Which you can see like the elites are being corrupt and they're pushing down wages. And that's what Bernie emphasized. And I think Warren emphasized elite corruption. And I think it's just harder to see the elite corruption if you're not in the elites.
Elite corruption, and I think she paired it with a much more identitarian message, which is something that we covered here extensively.
Yeah, especially towards the end, the more recent time. times of her
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of elite, the like woke frame in general, not speaking to Warren, but I think the woke frame is pretty aristocratic.
Right.
Like that's what it is. The woke frame is not about social justice. The woke frame is about in-group signaling among fellow aristocrats, which is really problematic because it's not actually about racial and gender-based justice.
Very well said. You know, the Warren campaign uses Latinx. Chuck Rocha, who just got Bernie 73% of the Latino vote in Nevada, uses the term Latino because it turns out that's what they actually use. Thank you, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Always great to have your insights, Matt.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Coming up, Democrats are saying no thanks to Never Trumpers offering up their votes.
And the new polling shows Bernie solidifying his lead. Our panel is next.